You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at TeachThought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at TeachThought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes TeachThought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins, the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. And if you're interested in TeachThought Professional Development, we offer services and workshops in a bunch of different areas, project-based learning being the focus of this podcast, but inquiry and differentiation and growth mindset and on and on and on. So if you'd like to learn more about the services that we do offer, please jump on over to wegrowteachers.com and you click on the workshops button. You can also click all over the place to check out the podcast and blog pieces that we offer, as well as, of course, our summer TeachThought PBL Grow 18 event in Louisville, Kentucky. Registration should be open when you're listening to this, unless you're listening to it well after the publishing date. So hopefully you find any and or all of that interesting. If you have questions for me, you can email me straight away at drew@teachthought.com. And those can be questions about the podcast or suggestions for guests or questions about our services. In today's podcast, I spoke with Mike Hourahine, who is the CEO and co-founder of a platform that is built and designed to support teachers and learners in project-based learning called Edio. And we talked about their process in building the platform, some of their guiding principles in meeting learners where they are, some of the things that they offer around remote coaching, and then how they approach projects and project management, design, and assessment in the work that they do as professionals, and some of the lessons that teachers and students might be able to take away from that. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think there's lots of value in this platform and the way that they're approaching it. I hope you find the value in it as well. I am here with Mike Hourahine, who is the CEO and co-founder of an app, or not an app, a web platform called Edio that I think has lots of potential and caught my eye on my radar as it, I think, can be a really helpful tool with project-based learning, but certainly is not limited to project-based learning. So, Mike, welcome to the podcast, and I'm going to give you an opportunity, as I generally do, to give you some time to give our listeners a little bit of background on who you are, kind of how you got to where you are, and what makes you tick.
Sounds good. Thanks, Drew. I'm really happy to be here. I guess I got started in education about 20 years ago, year 2000. I have a computer science background, and I was a technology consultant at IBM, and actually ended up doing a little contract at a private school up here near Toronto. That's where I'm from. And they were happened to be looking for an IT director at the time, and that's how I kind of started in education. And since then, I've kind of done every kind of role you can imagine. I taught computer science for 8 years while I was there, rolled out all kinds of technology, and early on really kind of looked at it as like, let's get technology into the classroom, and then kind of started to realize that, what are we doing with all this? Is it really adding value? And I really kind of started to become more and more interested in the convergence of school leadership, learning, and technology, and kind of spent my career exploring different avenues in that. So
as we talk about the platform itself, and the website is www.getedio.com. is listed on Google search, at least, as the project-based learning platform. But as I mentioned earlier, you support design thinking, and as you're growing and building this platform, I think it's important to note that it doesn't just do one sort of way to do project-based learning, but interestingly, I think is an interesting part of it is that it allows students and learners to develop their own projects, and I think it's an important shift in project-based learning. We do lots of workshops in project-based learning, and certainly we want teachers to be able to understand the shift and the pedagogy behind that, but ideally we're having students really design their projects, and that's I think down the road, and certainly a progression of the shift. But I guess tell us a little bit about how you have gone about building the platform and the various pieces of it, and how in your mind you see that supporting teachers and learners in project-based learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So myself and my co-founders are really passionate about empowering learners. So, and we have kind of 4 guiding principles for the company, and the first one is meet the learners where they are. And that can take on a variety of kind of interpretations or meanings, but essentially this is all about the kind of individualization, personalization conversation. And we really think that the way to go there is to empower them as much as possible to design and run with their own learning in a really kind of supported and coaching way. You mentioned scaffolding earlier, so we recognize that you can't just start there necessarily, especially if students have kind of grown up in a environment where they're just given what they need to know and asked to kind of spit it back. So we need to kind of help guide them there, and so that's essentially what we founded the company on. We're looking to support project-based learning initially because we think that's a really good framework for empowering learners. But essentially, whatever we can do to help make the shift for teachers to become mentors and coaches, and for students to become self-empowered, self-directed learners, and for schools to be future ready. And future ready gets tossed around a lot, but I think the key there is being agile, because there's all sorts of predictions about the future and robots taking our jobs and this and that, and the only real prediction is that the future is going to be unexpected and going to take twists and turns that none of us can really anticipate. So the only real model to move towards in education is one that's inherently agile and it can inherently adapt as the world adapts. And so that's kind of what we're about, is trying to use our skills and experience in technology and school leadership and education to kind of help bring about that change in the way we can.
Yeah, and there are some other tools out there, certainly in the project-based learning world. I think that it's because there's some inherent complexity in good, real quality project-based learning. The complexity makes it difficult for an app or a web platform or any technology tool to be able to sort of meet the needs of the users. I like that your website kind of talks about the emphasis on human powered but software supported, and that's a big shift from just having a platform or some piece of technology that does it for you and pushes it out there sort of prescriptively. There's lots of flexibility here and lots of ways that you can sort of customize the platform in a way that supports learners. But I guess if you might think about or talk a little bit more about what you mean by human powered and software supported.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a kind of big, I'm sort of a pet peeve of mine, I guess, is that, there's a lot of talk about personalization and the introduction of artificial intelligence, and a lot of those like so-called disruptors of education, they're looking to essentially replace teachers and replace adult mentorship, which we think is kind of the key part of education and learning and can never really be replaced. And so instead of replacing, we're looking at how do we employ technology to augment the process, right? And to develop really good relationships and facilitate really meaningful dialogue between learners and their mentors, right? And so I think that that's the future for us. That's a future we see is not one where we're sort of sticking students in front of iPads with personalized playlists of learning. We want to really kind of augment human interaction and natural kind of human mentorship and apprenticeship.
And one of the things that I think is a really nice way, or I guess nice is not the right word, but a really useful way to connect that coaching and human interaction is something that we really value, and we do. I know you and I talked about this sort of offline before we went live. What we do is our virtual coaching using Skype and Hangouts and things like that, but what you call the remote coaching in PBL for teachers. So what I know about good professional learning that is true, especially of a big shift like project-based learning, is that your questions don't always come on the scheduled professional development day. February 15th is our district-wide PD day, and that's where we get all our questions answered. The problem with that is, just like students, the questions should at least organically come. And so the kind of talk about, if you would, the remote coaching options that you've built in and you're looking to use so that teachers can get help when they need it, not just as the next PD day comes.
Yeah, absolutely. We think this is kind of a unique offering of what we're trying to do, and it comes out of my experience with I've run hundreds of professional development sessions about all kinds of different ways of integrating technology into the classroom over the years, and I've always found that the initial PD session was a good spark, but I usually made bigger gains with individual teachers by sitting beside them and answering questions as they went, and sort of being there as a resource. And I saw the biggest development in teachers when I was able to do that in my experience. And talking to lots of people, there's a kind of a similar experience where they go and attend these great PD sessions, come away with all kinds of ideas, and then are left to struggle afterwards. So in this platform, we're hoping so teachers it'll help scaffold them, because we said we want to meet the learners where they are, and we kind of see students and teachers as learners in this, and so they're going to be everyone's going to be on a different spectrum and in a different part of their kind of journey towards project-based learning. So we want to provide kind of a helpful guide along the way, and in this way, the guide can kind of have a lot more context. So they can essentially log into Edio and see what the teachers are trying to do, see what the students are trying to do, and provide some really kind of inline coaching right in the platform. And so just like you said, they can essentially be there when the issue occurs or the question arises. They can be there to kind of provide just-in-time feedback.
Yeah, and so talking about the feedback, one of the pieces that is always sort of often an elephant in the room is the assessment and then sort of report out. So tell us about the reporting features that you have and some of the options and ways that you've tried to tackle that elephant. Not that you'd want to tackle an elephant, but
so I think so the history of Edio, part of how we started was we actually started as a project within Think Global School. So if you haven't checked that out, you can go to thinkglobalschool.com. It's a kind of a really interesting school model, and I helped start that school. I was on the kind of founding team, and we made a transition from a more traditional model of education to a very project-based one, where half the projects are student-driven, half the projects are teacher-driven. But as we made this transition, we really it was important that we were demonstrating that we're covering the curriculum we need to, that we're doing all the things that we need to be doing as an accredited high school, ensure that we can produce transcripts for students to get into university and everything else. So we needed to have something like that in order to make the transition, or else our stakeholders would essentially kind of provide a lot of friction and prevent the transition from happening. And so that's part of the kind of fundamental parts is part of Edio is essentially be able to plan projects and tie them to learning standards or learning targets or outcomes, whichever you want to call them, and in a flexible way. So we can import any school's desired learning targets. They can plan projects against them, and then the assessment at the end of the project is generated based on the learning targets chosen and the competency model that the school uses, and allows teachers a really easy way to assess those targets on that particular project. But then the more important part comes when you zoom out and see, okay, well, a student has completed 10 projects. Now we can run these really kind of insightful reports to show which targets they've covered, which areas of the subject areas they've been tending to focus on, what they should, help guide their next project choice to make sure that they're covering the areas of curriculum that maybe have been under-addressed. And then in addition to that, we have a credit system that helps us to manage kind of credits over time. And the idea is that a high school could run themselves in a very project-based way, and a lot of our initial pilot schools are. But at the end, they can still generate a transcript that looks and feels and has all the things that a traditional transcript would. They just achieved that through a series of really great, authentic projects instead of regular classes and tests and assignments.
So the pieces that you have built in, talking about being user friendly, what are some of the, I know that again we had talked a bit offline about some of the sort of internal design and how you've tried to model your platform in ways that mimic some of the more user-friendly products that people might be familiar with. What are some of those, and kind of tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah, sure. So over the time of my career, I've used all kinds of project management software, and those have gotten much better over time. So we're really inspired by great web-based applications like Trello and Asana and Basecamp, and they all work. They're all sort of projects that I've had, or products that I've had experience using day in, day out. And we've really tried to learn from that and in making something that you're not fighting with, and it doesn't feel like a chore. It feels like it sort of just flows with the way that you work. Everything's built on a very modern platform. It's great to be a new player in this kind of space because you can make use of all the latest development tools. And so everything's real time by default. So if two people have the browsers open on different screens and everything's updating simultaneously, you never see a page reload or any of those kinds of things. It just looks and feels like an app. And we've also kind of learned from the flexibility of some of those project management tools and employing a Kanban board. If you haven't heard of it, is kind of a general, multi-column task board basically, and you move tasks around to indicate the status or to indicate, what kind of task it is, and it gives you a way to really support any kind of process, any kind of project in a very visual way, and we're getting really, really good feedback and seeing some really interesting uses of those task boards that are built into Edio.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that I've seen with some of the other pieces or platforms and things that are meant to support project-based learning or anything like this is they seem to struggle with some rigidity, and being able to move things, relabel things, and to have that flexibility inside of Edio is a real plus, although it obviously, or maybe not so obviously, is also a challenge, maybe that balance of teachers and educators who might be, and I guess even students who might be quite tech savvy and used to some of these things that you might be able to do, and then some who are quite the opposite, and that rigidity can actually be perhaps a bit of a benefit because it keeps them, it narrows the band of things that they have to consider. Because I think about my mother, who's 78 and a brilliant woman, but didn't grow up in the same technology-rich environment that many people younger than myself did, and educators. So being able to fluently traverse these platforms, has that been a challenge, and what are some of the other challenges that you've seen?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question right there for any platform. Essentially, is this balance between simplicity and complexity, because they're at odds with each other. And so when we talk to all kinds of different users in schools, we hear a lot of it would be great if it did this, it would be great if it did that, and we really have to balance that out. So whenever we hear a feature request, we entertain every feature request, and we look carefully about where this fits in and how we can present it to the users of the platform in the simplest way. And if we haven't figured out the easiest way to do that, then we'll leave it out until we do, because we feel like you have too many choices and it ends up getting in the way of the platform at all, or of using the platform effectively at all, especially for a new user if they have to make 10 decisions before they plan their first project. That's just going to be a big barrier to lots of people, right? So I guess the way it is a challenge, and it will be an ongoing challenge to kind of present that simplicity but also allow a lot of flexibility. The way we're approaching it is to try to have really good defaults. So there's a lot of configuration that can happen and different ways that you can use it, but we want to make sure that if you make no decisions and you just sort of click on start a project and start working away, that you're going to have a really decent process. And then if you want to start to customize it as a school, if you want different kinds of templates, if you want to have all kinds of different options, then you can make that available as you learn about the platform, but you shouldn't have to do that in order to just get started and get some value out of it, right? So
yeah,
so that is definitely a challenge, and it'll always be a challenge, I think.
Yeah, it's a challenge with any tech tool, and I think it's a challenge with anything that has complexity, that even if it's not technology, I mean, the project-based learning in and of itself is particularly complex. So as we think about that as a process of learning and growth, it's not something that happens in a workshop. It happens over time, and kind of similarly getting teachers to engage in what they feel comfortable with, and then moving from there so that the defaults are fairly simple perhaps, but the headroom, the ceiling is really, really high, and the user just essentially determines to what extent they want to explore and grow. The best teachers and the best tech savvy teachers, of course, will eke all and more value out of any platform than maybe even the users, or I'm sorry, the creators had even thought about.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, and you've talked about pilot schools and some of the schools that you've partnered with, what are some of the best cases or examples where you've seen Edio really adding value and being used in a really powerful way?
Yeah, I thought, well, one comment I'll make just on the previous point was the one of our teachers commented recently about, it's actually nice because they were the first pilot school, and they essentially used the product and it can only do one or two things. And as we added features, he started to get used to using them and everything. He said it was actually really nice to start with just the one thing and then add things as we go. And learn how to use them. And I thought that was really interesting, that we're going to try to capture when we bring new users on board, to not present all the complexity at once, because it's actually nice to say, here's a bunch of limited things, just turn on the other features when you need them, right? In terms of the task boards are interesting because they can be used in different ways. So one of the kind of earliest ways, one of our pilot schools is Lacrosse Design Institute in Wisconsin, and they're really great project-based learning mentors, and their kids do great work. But one of the ways they achieve the balance between student-centered and teacher-driven is they use the task board, and students plan out their projects, but the teachers create an extra column called mission control, and so students get to choose their own topic, and they work towards producing a product and all the learning that comes with it. But then the teachers will drop in these side missions that the students have to achieve in order to complete the project. And it allows them to go deep on particular topics that the student maybe hadn't thought of, or maybe it's a little bit tangential to achieving their kind of final goal. But the end result is it creates this kind of rich learning pathway that wouldn't have happened if the teacher was running the show completely or the student was running the show completely. And that to me was like one of the most, and that was fairly early on that they kind of figured this out, and it was really exciting and rewarding to kind of see the platform kind of enable that.
So it brings a question to my mind, and I think we've kind of traversed a little bit of this cognitive terrain in what we've already talked about, but it starts me to thinking about, we're talking about technology, tech-savvy teachers and others that are not, and all of this. Project-based learning is not necessarily, you don't need technology to do great project-based learning. So it certainly can elevate it, I'm not sure the word I'm looking for, but it really amplifies it. Can really amplify the benefits of it. But and maybe this is taking a step too far backwards, but what value does Edio or a platform like Edio bring to project-based learning, maybe for a teacher who is just, paper, pencil, used to doing that?
Yeah, I think, so I think that it's a really interesting question. I totally agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of, sometimes too much technology being applied to education. Now there's lots of different options. It's very different from when I started, where, the debate was whether technology belonged in the classroom. Whereas now it's something totally different. We're exploring ways of rethinking things in ways that technology allows. I think when it comes to someone it was a really good PBL teacher and has a PBL based classroom but doesn't employ some sort of platform, I think there's a lot of busy work there in terms of keeping track of what all the different students that are all following these kind of individual unique pathways also could be collaborating, so their pathways converge and then they diverge, and so there's just a lot of management that happens. And I think any time spent on trying to keep a PBL environment organized is time that could be better spent on really good mentorship conversations and advisory discussions and reflections and those kinds of things. So that's really what we're at the end of the day, what the platform is trying to do to support project-based learning, is to really free teachers and students up from trying to stay organized and trying to report and trying to assess and do all that, and allow them to really focus on key learning moments, key mentorship opportunities, building. We hear a lot from our project-based learning schools about how important adult learner relationships are. And the more our platform can kind of cut away the busy work and allow those relationships to develop and be deeper, then I think we're doing our job.
You're talking, when you say adult learner, you're talking about teacher, student?
Yeah, adult, student, yeah. Teacher, student, mentor.
Right, yeah. Right. So those coaching conversations, the narratives, the questions, and the ability to do that instead of sitting and doing paperwork and checking things off. It seems to me like if I think about it from a design thinking perspective of what problem are we trying to solve? What does paper planning with project-based learning or any kind of learning environment like this, what are the things that get in the way or that we could do better? Certainly duplicating documents and things like that. I think also the ability to do some collaborative planning in if you're doing cross-curricular and things like that. But this is not an LMS particularly. It has some LMS features, but where does it sort of fall on that spectrum of LMS and what's the other acronym? Student Information System or something like that?
Yeah. It's sort of it's funny. That's a hard thing for all ed tech companies. I think they can either define themselves narrowly by I'm an LMS or I'm an SIS, or they can sort of blue sky it, and I'm not either of those things. But then it's harder to say, well, what are you exactly?
Right.
So I think that's actually a challenge in marketing and messaging. But I wouldn't. I definitely wouldn't kind of pigeonhole us in one area, but we're definitely like one part LMS and one part assessment, kind of assessment system, and one part kind of collaboration, project management system. I think for schools that are some of our pilot schools that are full project-based learning schools, we're a little bit SIS as well, but we kind of, if you draw a big Venn diagram, we kind of overlap with all those in different ways. So we're not looking necessarily to replace those systems. We want to kind of work alongside and play nicely with them, but always with the mission of trying to empower learners in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. So one of the wonderful things about authentic learning environments is that you get the chance to make mistakes and learn from them. I'm wondering what kind of mistakes or things that you all have experienced with Edio that you tried and went, yep, that didn't exactly do what we wanted, or we didn't build this in and we really needed to build that in, or those kinds of things. What are the sort of path of mistakes that have really helped improve the platform to where it is today?
I think so. You talked about design thinking, and definitely iteration's a big part of this. I'd actually say, just to go back just for 1 second, the idea of kind of augmenting the paper-based thing, I think that's another area is being able to kind of reflect and build on what you've done before. And it's much easier to do that in a digital environment, to kind of say, okay, use this as a starting point and then do better, do 10% better than the last time, right?
Right.
And I think that's definitely key to the software development process, and it's really baked into how we do things in the industry is you try something, you put it in front of users and you gather feedback, and then you adjust. And there's already been, we're fairly young as far as an ed tech platform goes, but we've already kind of, we'll put an overemphasis on the planning form and how the comments would work in a process that was surrounding it. We put a lot of upfront effort into that, and it turned out to not at all be what our schools needed or wanted. And so, we ended up having to strip away functionality that we spent a lot of time building, right, realizing that they don't need this at all, but they need this other thing, right? So there's quite a few lessons learned that way, I think. There's lots more to come, but the way we approach development is to really not go too far with planning, and to really put it in front of people and listen and gather feedback and adapt that way. Otherwise, we would spend a lot of time. We'd learn that lesson I just said much too late, and we would have invested time and resources that we don't have as a young, lean company, right?
Right.
And so we got to be really careful about not going too far down the rabbit hole until we've proven that this is something that's going to be useful to people.
One of the things that I remember, I have not interacted with Blackboard and that LMS for quite a while, and thankfully, because it just seemed to be such a behemoth of stuff, that the way that I perceived Blackboard in the time that I did some work with, not for them or with them, but teachers using that and engaging in that platform, and certainly lots of good things about Blackboard as a platform. But what it seemed to me is that they started with something and then just kept adding layers and layers and layers, and it became just this giant multi-layered, just tremendously complex thing. And I would think that one of the challenges of building a platform is not doing that, not just, and schools do this all the time with PD, is just sort of add another thing instead of sort of stripping back and really being clear about your purpose and your mission and vision, and then saying, all right, is what we are trying to do matching that, and perhaps we need to really strip it back to the bare minimum and then rethink and go in a different direction instead of just adding something more. Is that been something you've experienced?
Yeah, the Blackboard example is such a good one, and I think it's been a while for me as well. So I imagine their platform is much more mature. But I used it back when it was partially a Perl script and partially something else, and even from a technology point of view, it was employing all kinds of different things. And
yeah,
I call it like the Frankenstein effect. At the end of the day, you're just like gluing all these pieces on, and it really like that comes through, and it makes it complicated for a new user to pick up, right? And I even have my own kind of experiences that way. At the start of Think Global School, there wasn't a lot of choices for learning management systems, and we wanted to do this kind of social sort of a fusion between Facebook and a learning management system. This is kind of even before Edmodo and stuff like that. And so, but I, because it was essentially myself and he's actually one of my co-founders, Jeff. Now we are developing this platform, and we could respond immediately to people. So they would say, I wish it could do this. And because it was small and we were small, and we could just, bang out that feature in a week, and I'd be like, look, we built that thing for you. and it was such a great learning lesson for me, because first of all, half the time we built that feature and then nobody would use it because they thought it was a good idea, but that doesn't mean they're actually going to use it. There's a big difference between what you think is a good feature and what is actually a useful feature.
Right.
And the other thing is it just became really hard to maintain, because now we had all these disparate features we'd bolted onto this system. Every one I loved. Like they were like little babies that we
right.
we developed, and we thought they were really cool and stuff like that. But if it's not getting used, it's not useful. And I think that to me is a big lesson for, I love the analogy between that and how we run schools, because I think a lot of times we're trying to please everybody and do everything, when if you just picked 3 things and focus on those, you would end up pleasing everybody without trying to do everything. And you can make use of your resources much better and not tire everybody out with all kinds of initiatives, right? So I think it's hard for us, because we also that means you have to say no, or you have to come up with clever ways of guiding feature conversations to, well, what would you use and how does that fit here? And often the initial conversation of I wish it could do this actually turns into something else, but something more meaningful. And it's important to kind of have that conversation in depth before you just jump to kind of just build it and do it, yeah.
Yeah, the clarity around purpose and mission and sort of what's your why is so important in schools and professional development. And teachers just absolutely get so fatigued by that continual pursuit of doing lots of things, and there's no denying that it feels like, oh, this is another thing on the plate. And so doing what you do well, even if it's a limited number of things, is certainly better than doing lots of things mediocre or even poorly, because it's just a matter of resources and focus, and we really strive to help schools understand that in the work that we do. And in what way is the work that we're doing with you helpful and contributing to that mission and vision that you have? And if not, then why are you doing it? And or do you need to revise your mission and vision? Are you clear about those things? So
yeah, it's so important.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of missions and visions in schools, they're not really they haven't really internalized them,
right,
or they're just sort of something that's a sign that's on the wall.
Right.
they don't really spend enough time. Those things are really important because, as one of my other co-founders says, that they're lighthouses, and so you need these lighthouses for when the storms happen, so how to kind of get through that storm and focus on what's important.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those, then you end up kind of doing the Frankenstein thing and jumping from one initiative to this initiative to that, and none of them really fit together nicely.
Yeah.
Whereas when you have really good lighthouses, then you can say, hey, you know what, does this actually achieve that goal? And if it doesn't, it gives you a really nice, justification for this thing. Let's just not do it,
Yeah. And when we think about, we use inquiry so heavily in all of our work, and I really think that schools should, I love the idea of, and when we work with them on big overarching, alignment of professional development and that kind of thing, turning that mission statement, assuming it's a good one, and if not, then you need to work on it to make it not just some platitude, but actionable and really thoughtful, but then turning it into a mission question and using that PBL process to say, all right, what do we need to know and be able to do in order to get there, to achieve that mission and vision. And then that's what should help us define our actions and, professional developments, the individual professional development, the building, the district, all of that. And then constantly reflecting back and saying, in what way did that meet the needs of our mission and our vision, and using that. So in the sense of what you're doing, it's essentially a project. So what does a day or a week look like for you and the Edio team? What might teachers take away from your process in a project-based learning environment? Because essentially that's what you're doing. That might be helpful in project design, project assessment, project management pieces.
Yeah, I think there's so many. That's such a rich question. Could go on for a long time about different pieces of it. I think one of the things that I'll just pull it from software development, the kind of software development world, is something called Agile software development, and that's a good one to just Google. And actually, there's some schools now. There's a couple different variations of that. One of them is called Scrum. They got all these great names and great terminologies. I was talking to a school district recently that have started implementing Scrum in the way they do their work, which I thought was really cool, because there's all kinds of things what have come to be in software development as necessities, because it's such a fast changing world and requirements change all the time, and you end up building things for people that they don't want, and you have to so you have to be very agile and adaptable, and there's all of these methodologies around around managing that process. And I think so that's kind of just something to look at. I think some of the key aspects of that is really starting small and then iterating and growing. So that's one thing we always do when we're starting with a new idea or feature concept. We start with this: what's the smallest, the MVP they call it, the minimum viable product. What's the smallest thing that you can put in front of people to let them try it, and then gather feedback, and then make some small improvements, and then grow it that way. And I think if I was a teacher new to project-based learning, it's a sort of a great lesson, because we can start with a really small scope but have big aspirations. Just start small and then kind of work your way towards it, And same with students is, sometimes one of the things I've noticed, I did a lot of project-based learning when I taught computer science, and they always started either with they had no idea what to do, or they wanted this huge project that they could never possibly get done in the time they had, right? And so always trying to encourage them to find a little chunk that you can get done, that you can check off and feel like you've accomplished something, learn from it, and then look at the next piece, right? And that is something as a company we're doing constantly in every aspect, whether it's sales, marketing, software development, even as a company. We've only been going for a year or so, but we've those lighthouses we've revisited as co-founders. We've revisited several times, and is this kind of what we want to do, and how we're going, right? So I think that idea of starting small and iterating constantly is really important. And the other thing is like this is all really messy. And if a colleague said to me once, if your classroom is really organized, or if the process is really organized, it's probably not authentic. And that's totally true, because I think in all aspects, every project I've ever been involved with, and it's hundreds over the years, and none of them have gone perfectly according to plan. And so you got to kind of embrace that messiness, and when things get tough, you don't quit. You reflect and adapt, and eventually sometimes you adapt into something you didn't anticipate, and sometimes maybe you adapt into something completely different, but you're not quitting. You're learning and growing, right? So,
are there any particular protocols or things that you do internally to sort of, I don't know if hold one another accountable is the right term? That is a struggle sometimes for teachers managing students and groups and individuals. Who's doing what happens when somebody doesn't sort of pull their load or do what they're supposed to do, and maybe you all are just absolutely knocking everything out of the park, but people are people, and
right, yeah.
Sometimes people don't get everything done to the quality that everybody expects. So what are some of those assessment and management pieces, if any, sort of protocols or specific things that you all do internally that help that?
I think regular check-ins are important, but they have to be kind of quick and fast. So I think the broad answer to that question is transparency. So making the process as transparent as possible. And this is another way a platform can really help, is that it's hard to hide when everything is out in the open to the whole group, or to the teacher, to the whole class even, or the whole school even. So the more transparent things are, the more people tend to focus on and are just held accountable by their environment, as opposed to a teacher coming down heavily on somebody. And I think when you do these kind of regular check-ins, we do one, a daily stand-up. They call it a stand-up in Agile software development, because they basically hold meetings where everybody's standing, so that the meetings don't go too long. so they actually call it a stand-up because it's supposed to happen every day, and it's not supposed to be any more than 5 to 10 minutes. We actually do it via Slack, so because we're a remote company, so we check in via Slack. But the daily stand-up is sort of what did I do the last 24 hours? What am I going to do the next 24 hours? And what blockers do I have, if any? And just that process of like daily putting that up holds you accountable, because now you're saying the next 24 hours is going to be focused on these things. If I don't do those, if I regularly don't do those things that I'm committing to, then it becomes really obvious, right? And so when it comes to reflection time, then you can kind of tackle those issues, not necessarily a confrontational way. It's more like, hey, we're missing a lot of these things. How can we help you? How can we help you not miss it?
Right.
How can the team help you be better? And it can be done in a really positive way, as long as you're being transparent, but also taking the time to reflect and adjust as you go.
One of the differences, of course, I would imagine at least, in your setting versus many classroom settings, is that you're not assigning grades, but that I think gets to a point, not that you should be assigning grades, but that perhaps assessment in schools should look different, and grades are somewhat problematic in that. And there's certainly some constraints that most teachers in schools have. You I'm guessing, don't go through your day in first period, second period, third period kind of thing. It's just a sort of fluid, organic work environment. And again, what if our schools looked more like that? And what if our schools looked less like grades and periods and things like that? But that's probably a whole other discussion.
Yeah. I think just, super quick on that one. I think the biggest issue for me with the way things are structured is the hard punctuation at the end of every learning moment, and there's no time built in essentially anywhere to really really reflect and learn upon your mistakes. They hit you as mistakes, and then you just have to live with them, because now you got a crummy mark that you can't go back and change, or you got a group project that went awry, but I don't have any time to put it straight. And so there's all kinds of these rich learning moments that are not, they're just not in there, and it's just not how the world works, right? So I see that happen to my kids all the time in their classes. That, they do this great project, but stuff goes wrong, and it's stuff that would always go wrong, but they don't have enough time to fix it, and they just sort of treat it as a failure and move on, and that's not the right message. So if anything, can we build in more time or less hard punctuation at the end of these learning experience, and more fluidness to be able to really reflect and adapt properly.
Yeah, that is a real problem, and it does take an intentional effort, because especially for teachers, there's that urgency to cover, quote unquote, cover so much. So you've got to go. And we challenge schools and leadership and anybody who will listen, to consider slowing down, and kind of like doing lots of things mediocre or poorly that we talked about earlier, doing fewer things but doing them well. And that's where your deeper learning pieces come into your thinking, processing, and it's one thing to be presented with some information, it's another thing to deeply think about it, and that I think is the value of great teaching and learning, not just covering all of this stuff. And that reflection period can be so valuable in any situation. So it's really hard for schools and teachers to remember that. It's hard for us in our workshops. I mean, it really is. It feels like we're either our expectations is that we're taking the 2 or 3 days or however much time we have to get as much out of it as possible, and that sense that we don't have time to reflect on this, don't have time to process, give you time to process, that I want to get this other thing in front of you, because I'm not going to be here next week when you might have time to do it, and gotta go. Maybe you can reflect on it on your own sometime, but
right.
It's a real challenge. So
no, it's tough. Not at all oversimplifying it either, because I've lived it as well. Trying to do that, and it's a multifaceted issue for sure.
Yeah. So what's on the horizon for Edio? What are you working on, and where do you hope you'll be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
So I mean, our kind of short-term focus right now is this is essentially a pilot year for us. So we've been working with all these great project-based learning schools. We're bringing more on board each week, and we're sort of ramping up for the 2018-19 school year. And so essentially the platform is being targeted as single small charter schools that are already doing innovative teaching and learning. And we're trying to kind of meet and connect with as many of those and try to help them support their goals. And that's kind of our initial target, I guess. The where we want to grow into is to be a transformational tool. So, I mean, the problem that you just articulated is frames it perfectly, and however we can employ our skills and our software and technology to help solve that problem is really what our mission is, and to help a school that wants to take a journey towards something new, something different, something that's going to serve students from all walks of life and all types of backgrounds and all types of learning styles. It's someone that serves those students better, and something that engages them in a really authentic way. And that's kind of what we're looking to do is essentially become a transformational tool for schools that are doing things in a very traditional way today and want to move towards that new model, but give them a tool that kind of, again, meets the learners where they are, the teacher, school, student, where they are today, and helps guide them to something new.
And so if I'm let's say a building administrator or school administrator, or maybe even a teacher who wants to investigate and, let's say, try out or use Edio, what are my next steps here?
So hit us up at edio.com. There's a big button to schedule a demo. That's generally a conversation with me, and we want to connect with as many different types of people as possible and hear what they're trying to do, and we can show you what the platform looks like. You can follow us on Twitter. We're Edio at Edio app is what the handle is. So both of those things we want to hear from lots of people. We're working on an individual teacher version. So if you're an individual teacher out there that wants to do this in their classroom, we'd love to hear from you as well. And hopefully we can deliver a tool for a single teacher sometime soon.
Right. Yeah. It's I'm sure a challenge as you try to navigate all of the different pieces, and again, kind of keep doing what you do well, but not get spread too thin and do poor or mediocre work. So
it's tough.
Yeah. One last question before I let you go here. We've talked a lot about Edio and some other tools, but are there any particular resources, books, videos, or things that you have come across in maybe the last 6 months or so that you say, well, this really was really interesting and sort of thought-provoking. People should know about this and watch this or read this or see this or that kind of thing?
Where do I start on that? So, I mean, I like what they're doing with the high quality project-based learning. I think it's a good initiative. The Buck Institute's behind that. I think it gives some food for thought for sure. In terms of books, I mean, I read a lot and always looking for kind of inspiration, different things. There's a book called Essentialism, which it gets to the heart of what we were talking earlier, but trying to do a few things really well. So I'd encourage anyone to check that out. It's gives you some things that, it's the decision that cuts 1,000 decisions off is one of the kind of the key elements there. So that's a great book, worth looking into. And it for schools that are looking to really transform their entire way of doing things. We have a partnership with a great organization called EdVisions, and they provide support for whole learning, learner-centric education as well. And they run a neat tool called the Hope Survey, which allows you to gauge where you are today, and then as you implement these things, you can move forward. So yeah, there's 3 random things to check out.
All right, you forgot to mention TeachThought, of course, but
oh, of course, TeachThought. Yeah. No, and I would say, I mean, I listen to TeachThought and read TeachThought, and I love the stuff that you guys do, and I love the conversations I've heard, and I'm honored to be part of the mix.
Yeah, and that was not a paid plug there. Mike, do you have a personal Twitter or anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, my name is Hourahine. If you didn't hear at the start, Drew, you did a great job pronouncing it because hardly anyone can. So my Twitter handle is mhourahine, MHOURAHINE, and I love Twitter, and I love connecting with people on Twitter. So feel free to reach out there.
And we'll put all those as usual in the show notes and that kind of thing. So I'm looking forward to see where Edio goes, and I know you and I have had some discussions about potentially embedding Edio and TeachThought PD work, so potentially listeners might be involved in TeachThought PD and Edio down the road. And thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Drew. Appreciate it.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.